Grange groped along the wall until he found a power switch. When he flipped it, a series of dim sodium lights flared, pushing back the endless dark. They were in a cavern, a vast, man-made edifice hewn from the hard rock of the mountain. The decrepit series of rails they'd crossed outside continued here, emerging from under the deadfall and disappearing into the depths. This was unmistakably the old mine's main entrance. Signs of ancient habitation were present in the form of fire-blackened barrels, ringed by crates and large rocks. The remains of makeshift campsites, old food and beverage containers littered the floor, and a pyramid-shaped can of Faro beer sat on the end of the rail cart as if someone had just placed it there. The air was still and oppressive, the cave very empty. Almost empty. Off to one side, something lurked in the shadows where the pools of light didn't seem to reach. It drew Kevin's attention with a sudden spike of adrenaline. He squinted, but couldn't quite make out what it was, save for that it was huge. It remained little more than a shadow, black against the charcoal of the walls. Grange strode straight towards the object, stepping carefully through the detritus. Kevin followed hesitantly. It was cold in here in the bowels of the earth, colder than he would expect for a desert summer. The slightest footfall echoed in the dark, and he trod softly where he could. He had heard the term, as silent as the grave, before, but only now understood its meaning. It was a revelation he could have lived without. At the set of rails, he stopped. There had been a sound, but it was gone now. He tried to think, but couldn't quite recall what it had been. A whisper? He must have imagined it. But Grange had also stopped, staring intently at the hulking shadow, his face unreadable. Unease clenched his stomach. The barracks suddenly seemed a long way off. As they drew nearer, Kevin saw that Grange hadn't been joshing him. The hulking form was a mech. He expected the dim light would reveal a loader mech, or even an old mining mech. But never this. It was a Marauder. Nuclear fire and horrifying amalgamations of flesh and technology define the era of the bleakest assault on the Inner Sphere. At every turn there were horrors unleashed upon the people of the Inner Sphere in this nightmarish age. But not all by the Blakists. An ancient evil, a Battlemech from an age long past, was set free in response to those who dwelled on Terra. One which was thought to be controllable, wieldable even, leashed and bound. But such creatures have no masters of their destiny. beyond perhaps themselves. Themselves, as if a machine could think or have its own desires. The origins of the horror known as the Dark One are not fully known, but there are hints, shreds of data from the time of its seeming creation that extends back into the age before the clans, before the end of the Star League even, to a time known as the First Hidden War. The Star League had come to incorporate all of the core states of the Inner Sphere beneath its banner, as well as forcibly integrating the Periphery nations along the outer reaches of mankind's influence. The Camerons, the family which ran the Terran Hegemony, and sat upon the throne of the First Lordship of the Star League, had to do a great deal to keep its subordinates in line, whereas in theory all other lords of the Star League had equal authority. The houses of Davion, Merrick, Liao, Steiner, and Carita. The truth was the Camerons were more than just the first amongst equals. The Star League was their empire. They simply had limits to their control over these satraps, these vassals. And those limits were tested most in the realm of the Draconis Combine. The Combine's warrior-driven society, its leadership, and societal ego could not stand to be ranked amongst the lower houses of the League. While other houses plotted and schemed for their own power and position, Carita pulled against the chains of its bondage with a hatred and vigor the other houses could have only dreamt of, at least at the time of what would become known as the First Hidden War. The Edict of 2650 by the Star League had forced many great houses to dismantle several regiments of units, but it was felt most in the home of the Dragon. Many of these units would lose their prized warrior status. House Carita itself believed the edict had been enacted specifically to target their own glorious realm and its armies from gaining in strength, especially against the bully force that was the Star League Defense Forces. The SLDF, while on paper being an army for all, meant to protect the interests of the Star League and keep the peace, was often the private army of the First Lord of the Star League, enacting the will of the Director General of the Terran Hegemony before all others. Military bases were strewn around the Inner Sphere as well, including inside of the Combine, where they were increasingly unwelcome. The Draconis Combine, after this edict, had regressed from the rest of the League, isolating itself socially and economically where they could. The clear influence of Japanese culture, too, at this time, only became more prominent as well. An interest in Bushido, an ancient code of honor for samurai warriors, began to gain traction, notably far more than it had before. This resulted in House Carita exploiting this new culture amongst its warriors by elevating Mechwarriors based on their unwavering loyalty to their family and the state, based on these ancient codes. And in response, these Mechwarriors were granted many privileges. By the late 27th century, the Hidden Wars had begun, as duels began to be challenged against SLDF Mechwarriors, with the first taking place on the world of Benjamin. At first, the base commander refused to participate in the absurd gesture, a demand for combat by one of these local would-be samurai. Mechwarrior Kazutoyo Amanda, in her Battlemaster, after 10 days of waiting, would be given satisfaction when Lieutenant Bradley Grebbers, in his Warhammer, would march out to meet her in this duel. The battle was 10 minutes long, and was a vicious engagement, but it ended with Kazutoyo disabling the Warhammer's legs, before decapitating the downed mech with a PPC blast, ruthlessly ending Grabber's life. Rage burned within the SLDF base and staff, but they held back. A full open war could not be allowed to take place. The trend, however, had started. Warriors of the Combine, looking to prove themselves and undermine the Star League's authority, sought to humiliate the SLDF in these duels. This may have even been used as a tool to end the shame of the occupation of many of their worlds by the SLDF military. Challenges would continue, and more SLDF pilots were killed or humbled before the champions of the Dragon. The First Lord would begin to be more than concerned with these developments, as the respect for the League began to slide radically within the Combine due to the knowledge of their repeated failures. The DCMS pilots were too skilled, or they may have been using a new technology to assist them. In fact, the League was convinced the only way the SLDF could be underperforming to such a degree was technology. A plan was put into motion to capture one of the Combine mechs, and preferably the pilot, to review the specific cause of the difference in the two sides. Outside of Fort McHenry on Leston, a Ronin Mechwarrior in his Battlemech had approached the gates, attempting to goad out the SLDF from within. The trap was set, however, as mechs flanked him, shoving the unknown mech type and the unaware pilot within, through the gate before sealing the doors once more. The pilot would die by his own hand before agreeing to leave his mech, but it was of little consequence, for the League had its prize. Only, it wasn't a prize. The entire mech was torn down, looking for the advanced actuators, or new technologies, that would account for their horrendous underperformance. It was determined, after this plot, that the Draconis Combine mustered soldiery were, in fact, just producing Mechwarriors who were of a wildly higher caliber than their Star League counterparts. The First Lord, in an admission of defeat, immediately ordered all of his soldiers to take no more duels or challenges until further notice. By 2682, the duels had resulted in a multitude of lost mechs, as well as a slew of dead pilots and wounded. The fallout was unfortunately immediate, with the coordinator simply referring to the SLDF as cowards, and mocking the First Lord over it. The duels would resume, but only after the Star League initiated its Advanced Combat and Maneuvering Skills program, graduating dozens of pilots to fight back against these skilled warriors. These pilots went through rigorous, incredible training and testing. They were rebuilt physically and mentally, but they also went through advanced neural treatments as well, helping them to relearn and acquire whole new ways of fighting. This program would evolve later into the Gunslinger program. This is where the history ends. The Gunslingers would engage the Combine in their challenges. The numbers would even out significantly, and the Combine only barely kept the edge. It was enough for the League to keep its dignity. But the Star League was never one for simply a draw. Their power was never built on anything beyond domination, true victory, and they had the most talented scientists in the whole of the Inner Sphere. 2 projects, both draped in mystery, would be put forward during all of this. 2 projects that would become one. It was the ultimate attempt to finally put the Combine in its place. Operations Butterfly and Bee. Incomplete files and documents discovered in the 32nd century would put these 2 desperate efforts on display. They appeared to be directly connected to the Hidden War, and the efforts of the Star League to bottle up the Combine. These projects seemed to begin in the 2670s, but ended before the decade passed through. The project, at least Butterfly, seemed to have been headed by one Professor Nathan Heisler, a neuroscientist. He contributed greatly to the science of the mind throughout his life, helping to treat a multitude of people, as well as direct conditions of a neurological nature. If the public knew at the time what he had done, or would do, there would have been no celebration of his work. Operation Butterfly, and the work he was most responsible for, had been attempting to create a new, significantly more sophisticated neural interface for pilots. The professor and his team's labors resulted in unexpected results. In fact, the results were horrifying. This new neural interface, if it did benefit the pilots who tested it, also did something to them. Something wrong. In fact, pilots, experienced pilots, were beginning to succumb to it, and were losing their minds. The first seemed to be one Colonel Mechwarrior, but there were others. Reports were kept with Professor Heisler, but enough data would be sent back to his superiors in the Star League, especially after the deaths of pilots, that it could bring scrutiny from on high. Some of the remnants of the surviving reports showed the perverse circus of the mind the professor had led in the name of progress, and in the name of the Star League. General Murchison. The passing of Colonel Mechwarrior has affected us all. He was a true professional, and had many friends here. That he would do such a thing is as disheartening as it is shocking, and we find ourselves asking what signs we missed, and what we could have done differently. The family here will miss him as much as his beloved back on Calf. Though it pains me, I must look past his loss to the future of the project he, and I, and many others, have poured our effort into. I assure you that Mechwarrior's action was unrelated to Butterfly, or any of its components. I don't know what rumors may have reached your ears, but I know what circulates here. Mechwarriors are like wet Navy sailors, remaining a superstitious lot. Despite centuries of research, there have never been any sign that shouting into the void produces an answer. I know another death brings another review. I beg you not further volunteers. Let hard science be your guide when determining the future of Butterfly. All of my data is open to you. Our progress has been significant. A reliable, repeatable increase in piloting efficiency is just a start. The combined samurai Colonel Mechwarrior often spoke of will not easily overcome that. Regards, Professor Nathan Heist. Sadly, the experiments didn't end there, and became more bizarre. In fact, those from the future, members of Clan Snowraven and Wolf, would even receive a message, seemingly across time and space. The subject of a recorded interview, a test pilot for Project Butterfly, could almost sense people in the future staring at him through the monitor. He is known as only P-05, and he was another victim of the professor's ambitions. The image crackled to life, an artifact of its corrupt nature. It seemed more interrogation than debrief, with a lone subject sitting under harsh light in an otherwise dim room. The gaunt, disheveled man huddled with his body turned slightly to the right, arms loosely crossed over his belly. He stared into nothingness, but not without seeing. It was as if he was focused on one spot, but saw all. His lower lip worked, making a rhythmic popping sound every time it hit its upper mate. There seemed to be a pattern of tiny pops, a language spoken by the hopelessly insane. A voice came from off-screen, an electronic crackle. The speaker was not in the same room. P-05, I need you to be more specific. Windows. The man's voice was a cracked, broken wasteland. Windows and doors left open. Windows and doors? The interrogator sounded disinterested, almost mechanical. Which doors? P05 shook his head. When you punch a hole through someone's home, they get mad at you. They can yell at you through that hole, reach a fist through and try to strangle you. Who are they? P05, in order for us to help you, we must understand what has happened. Who are they? All around, all the time, everywhere. Unseen or unrecognized. There's someone behind you staring at me. He wants to know why he's me. I hear them whisper. They don't let me sleep. Do you recognize their voices? They are me, and they aren't. Me in other bodies. Them in me. A version of me with 4 heads and 8 eyes. With a sword in one hand and a severed head in the other. Why would I do that? I see colors past the rainbow. P05 poked at a spot on his head. Here. I see them here. And over here is where I hear them. And this is the spot they took out and put back in backward. I hate you. Focus, P05. Tell us what voices you hear. P05 scratched at his temple, a previously shaved spot now growing in grayishly. I'm not insane. I know you think it, but I'm not. It's just that the words aren't really there. How do you explain depth to a flat man? Maybe the observers don't like being observed. I don't like watching you. He looked up, straight into the camera. It was as if he saw across the centuries and spoke directly to Terran and Lydia, the clan observers. They are watching me right now. They can see us, but we can't see them. They want answers too. That part had disturbed Terran the most. Even knowing it was coming, he looked away. Lydia flinched not at all. Static overtook the feed. When it cleared, P05 was pacing in the tiny room. My Alice, my Allison, mine, not mine, mine again. I miss them, whom I've never met. Whoever was P05, his fate remains unknown. It is also of note that he is not Colonel McCaddy, having a wildly different appearance to the man in question. More bizarrely, he appeared to know about the deceased McCaddy and of his family. Alice had been Colonel McCaddy's wife, and his daughter had been Allison. His fate at the time of the recording remains unknown, but one final entry reveals at least a part of what happened to him. The hollow resumed, with P05 becoming more and more agitated. His vocalizations became less comprehensible, until he picked up his chair and began smashing it into the wall. Then he shouted clearly, You vacuumed up my brain! You sucked it out and mixed it with mush! Then threw it back in and expected me to be me! I want to be me! I want to be me! P05 began crying. He hurled his chair at the camera, knocking it into the ceiling. The rest was only sound, a door opening, a few crashes, and deep voices of men trying to restrain P05, and his final, belabored screams. You let them in! You shoved them back in here, and they don't want to be here! Get them out! Get... All of this, however, encompassed only Project Butterfly, the neural interface experiment, not the project it was forced to be merged with. Project B. Headed by a figure named Dr. Morrison, there was far less data about this particular project, but one can infer from what it was that this had been some kind of new Battlemech, a kind of advanced prototype. The bitter Professor Nathaniel Heisler would leave his own thoughts to the corrupted journals. For at least 6 more months, combining the projects was a mistake. B is a disappointment that is dragging down. Dr. Morrison refuses to admit failure, but the humanoid biomers simply do not show any improvement, unless you count the added bulk. Lift ferrofibrous armor. Such ugliness. Whatever it had been, it was comprised of ferrofibrous plating and had bulk. It was even considered ugly. Something unnatural, perhaps, would be what Nathan had been trying to describe. We know the least about Project B, outside of its mech-related nature, and of course, how it had been attached with Project Butterfly. Project B, it can be assumed, may have been outfitted with a neural interface, which the Star League had been trying to perfect even. As a quick aside, did you know that the Marauder was in fact one of the main preferences in regards to battlemechs of the Star League era gunslinger pilots during the Hidden War? I just thought I would mention that here, for no particular reason, of course. The project would be shut down in 2677, and this included Heisler shutting down his laboratory on Defiance, within an SLDF base. Apparently, his attempts to bring the Hidden War to a close and enhance the Star League were a failure. But it begs the question, whatever happened to the neural interface that seems to have stolen the minds of the men who donned it? Was it not integrated into Project B? One must wonder, whatever became of that mech? The Marauder leered at him, daring him to come closer, to come into the pit. It taunted him with its wrongness. It was nothing he could put his finger on. The reverse knee joints of the leg, the torso rotating ring, the particle projection cannon's housings, all looked somehow off. As if it weren't a genuine Marauder, but a copy made by someone who had seen one once, and then recreated it from memory. That thought formed his next question. Where did it come from? Grange shrugged. Who knows? It has no serial numbers, and it hasn't been removed. It's just not there. Kevin frowned. Every machine in the Inner Sphere, from toasters to dropships, had a serial number. The results of Project B and Project Butterfly were a mystery to the world. The Star League would never have all the information for the project, and it would become one of 1,000 research and development projects that were just filed away and lost. It's unknown what happened to Dr. Morrison or Professor Heisler after their projects were slowly but surely undone. Beyond tethers holding these projects to more current events, it can never be said for sure where it came from, or how it got on that asteroid. You may be asking, what is it? It is something that was meant to be forgotten it wasn't just lost. It was hidden away, sealed like a monster within a tomb where no one was meant to find it. Did the Star League leave it out there, in the void, hoping no one would find it? Hoping no one would find what they had made? Was it the research staff who went rogue, placing it outside of reach? Was it something completely unrelated? Was it born there? Was it manifested in the darkness? No one can be sure. Who would believe any of these answers anyway? But after the Fourth Succession War, in an uninhabited system one jump away from Malagrota, in a system with nothing but asteroids and gas giants, without any bases or habitation, the Capellan Dragoons, a unit of the Federated Commonwealth, more specifically from the half that was the Federated Suns, were recharging in system on their way back from pirate engagements near the Taurian border. And during those days of recharging, the crew decided to explore around the system while waiting to jump. Life can be very boring on dropships, especially in the days of the Succession Wars. Hell, there was even the small fraction of excitement that maybe some Star League relic or base could be in system, just waiting to be discovered. Sometimes, it's best not to wish for things, because you might just get what you asked for. Inside the system, they would find something. Something which was meant to be forgotten. On one of the bigger asteroids we found that. Grange jerked a disdainful thumb at the Marauder. With sheer dumb luck, we'd passed that rock inbound and missed it. But on the way out, there it was, plain as can be. Standing out there in the dark, lord of all the nothing it could want. At the time, we thought it was a blessing. Brand new Marauder and nobody to dispute our salvage rights. So we loaded it onto our Union and took off. We should have known right then. It had no markings, no ID number, no unit insignia, nothing. God only knows who left it there, or why. No, I know why. His eyes unfocused, and he bowed his head for a moment before continuing. And it was so clean. Sitting on that asteroid for Kerensky knows how long. And not a speck of dust on it. A couple of the more religious guys wanted to leave it there. Said it must have been some shrine to some long-forgotten warrior or something. And it would be sacrilegious to take it. Seemed silly at the time. But given what followed... The presence of this Marauder was immediately felt by some. It was as if there was something wrong with it. But what happened when they made the jump out of the system? It would stay with anyone. When the ship jumped, everyone had a bad jump. Repeated exposure to jumping or faster-than-light travel in Battletech can have impacts on the mind. Even for those who are the sanest people in the world, crews do get examined for signs of what's called jump psychosis. No one on board the ship had any sign of it, though, and everyone had a bad trip. But none more than Tommy Thompson. After the jump, Thompson would start screaming. It was maddened. It was like he was being stalked by the devil itself. In his fearful ravings, between his howls and screams, he would begin ranting about them. He would begin speaking about how they had been sleeping, and that somehow the crew had opened the door. He would begin chanting over and over again, as if he were praying. The ship's doctor assumed it was classic jump psychosis. Only, when Tommy was sedated, there was no effect. In fact, Tommy would slip out of his confinement and he began a chase through the entirety of an Invader-class jump ship, The search for him was intense, but eventually they'd find him passing through the jump core. The fact that he was there, and could have damaged or tampered with the systems, meant the captain after the incident would not jump the ship for weeks until he was absolutely sure there had been no tampering. Truth be told, Thompson wasn't interested in any of that. He wasn't crazy, after all. He was just trying to get away. This was where he found the maintenance airlock. Staring back at the 3 men who had found him, he calmly and almost with relief discharged the airlock with himself inside. He was cast into the void without any protection. Tommy Thompson was the first victim. There would be more. The next incident within the unit would be the fate of Rexmond, a mech tech working inside of the Dragoon's dropship. The tech had the misfortune of maintaining the mech, and it'd be the last thing he ever did. Rexmond apparently had been unloved by his compatriots, described as a miserable bastard, which is in all probability why he was given the horrible duty of managing this uncomfortable monster in the mech bay. One day, after finishing changing out the mech's coolant, he slipped on a puddle of the pooling liquid, making a complete fool of himself. The rest of the unit descended upon him with laughter like hyenas for his trouble, always willing to get a chuckle at his misfortune, it would seem. Lashing out in response, Rexman didn't blame his own sloppiness, but instead turned his ire towards the cursed mech he'd been left to manage. He began more specifically cursing the machine in the open, spitting back at it angrily, as if it caused the spill he'd slipped in somehow. This, of course, only led to more laughter, until it put an end to the amusing display. A particle projection cannon was discharged, vaporizing the upper half of the raging technician. Terror filled the mech bay as panicked staff were dispatched, trying to determine what had gone wrong. In order to operate, or even fire a PPC, the mech's fusion reactor needed to be activated. When the mech was checked over, not only was the cockpit empty, it was found the fusion reactor had not been activated. The mech had been cold. To have this kind of malfunction was impossible, but yet, Rexmond was dead. By this PPC blast all the same. It was just unexplained. But now, the Mechwarriors, technicians, and other support staff were starting to become increasingly worried. Still, everything had been circumstantial so far, and the Capellan Dragoons needed mechs in action, not mech bay squatters. So it was put into duty. What happened next was something with no true explanation. A Mechwarrior named Jahi, a devoutly religious man, would agree to take up the Battlemech, despite its wretched reputation. He would head out on training missions inside of the machine, practicing maneuvers and coordination. He would become separated on one of these outings from his peers, however, and in the middle of the day, he was unable to find his allies once they'd become separated. The mech vanished from sensors, as if it faded into nothingness. Despite the sky being clear and open, the sun was out. The only thing they heard was him on the comms. He stated his sensors were down and that he could no longer see the sun. Colonel Johnstad, the commanding officer, yelled furiously at the now missing Mechwarrior, blaming Zahi's incompetence, and issued an order for the entire battalion to hunt for him. Despite infantry, vehicles, and mechs searching for him, nothing could be done. He was ordered to stop moving, but his comm signal was only getting more distant. At one point, he was ordered to stop, to get out, and fire a flare. But it never happened, and the sun slipped away. In the middle of the night, Jahi began to scream and rave madly in his native Arabic. The Dragoons thought he'd come under attack from pirates, but he didn't respond to anything over said communications. He stopped screaming, only to give a long, unnatural moan before he began to chant. He began chanting the same thing Thompson had, before he spaced himself only days after finding the Obsidian Marauder. Then the line cut out. An hour later, they found the Marauder. It was standing out in the open, in a valley, one which they had swept 3 times. The cockpit was sealed, and there was no sign of Shahi. The neural helmet was even put back into place appropriately. After this tragedy, Colonel Johnstad would attempt to reassign the mech for years, but no one would take it. After everything that had happened, after the jump ship incident, after the impossible firing on a technician, while powered down, after Jahi's disappearance, and finding it in the open an hour later, to the Mechwarriors of the Capellan Dragoons, the mech was poison. Finally, as if to prove a point, Colonel Johnstad would claim the mech for himself. One day, while out on maneuvers, the colonel would vanish for 2 hours, before finding his way back to base. All he said upon his return, looking pale, haggard, and shaken, was simply, "Get rid of it." Sergeant Grange and another Mechwarrior, Jim, would take it out to the Pashadan Flats, to an old abandoned mine, near a town which hadn't seen habitation since the time of the Star League. There, they would do what the last people who had stumbled across the Marauder had done. They cast it away, into the darkness. They put it somewhere no one would find it. They put it in the ground, and buried their troubles once and for all. Or so they had thought. Sometimes, it's best just to leave some things alone. Even in the darkest and most desperate of times, it's just not worth it. Don't look back. Look forward. Someone should have told Sergeant Grange this. Someone should have warned him. But by the time of the Blakest era, in December of 3073, as the whole world seemed to be teetering on collapse, well, desperate times call for desperate measures. Out in the flats, out where he'd buried the nightmare 40 years prior, the aging sergeant, the last of the people who'd laid hands on the cursed thing waiting at the bottom of that hole, knew that Warren, the planet he called home, and the Federated Sons needed every possible ally they could to stand firm against the nightmare that had been unleashed by Thomas Merrick's word of Blake, the Capellan Confederation, and even the Taurian Concordat. The new age of total warfare that had emerged after the Fedcom Civil War was something gut-wrenching, and even more sinister than the clan invasion had been. Now, it seemed like the whole inner sphere was set on fire, and weapons of mass destruction were being deployed on a scale not seen since the Second Succession War, including being deployed by the nearest threat to Warren, the Taurian Concordat. It was with this backdrop, with uncertainty in his heart as much as a sense of dread and defiance, that Sergeant Grange would return to the hole he'd cast it down, with one purpose in mind. It would be revived from its slumber, and it would have a new pilot. The pilot would be someone Grange trusted, and someone he knew had the skills to use the deadly device to its maximum effect, at least amongst the militia crew on Warren. That was a young Mechwarrior named Kevin Langstrom. The two would head out towards the mines, and they'd find the Dark One, the black-clad Marauder, sitting in the dark at the bottom of this pit. There, Grange would tell the tale of the monster he'd left behind, and the one he now sought to resurrect. "So why bring it back?" Kevin asked. "We're not hurting for mechs. You left it here through the clan invasion, the Civil War. What makes you think we need it now?" The old sergeant When he spoke again, his voice had turned somber, subdued. Because this era is a different kind of war, this looks like it could be the one. The war. The War of Blake isn't going to stop until the entire Inner Sphere is dead or singing the praises of Blake, and they've got the means to do it. And if this is Armageddon, then I want the devil by my side. You hear that? He yelled at the Marauder. We're going to war, you bastard! The two would work together, even though at the start Kevin seemed to be having second thoughts. The first time he would enter the Marauder, his nerves were on edge. But everything seemed so normal. The only thing was, the mech didn't seem to require the same as security authentication to get things up and running. In fact, all he'd needed to do to get the mech moving was to connect the neural helmet and begin the process of fine-tuning the system to his brainwaves. After bringing the beast to life, he simply heard, "Kindred soul." At first, the young pilot thought it was Grange, but there was no sign of him. Still, it meant he could relax. When he leaned back into the command couch, he felt a euphoria of sorts. When he closed his eyes inside of his mind, he could see colors. Colors beyond recognition. Shapes moved that he couldn't identify. After this, Kevin would be startled as Grange awakened him, having prepared the explosives. Langstrom had been in his own world of color and wonder inside of the Marauder for 2 hours, and hadn't noticed more than a few minutes go by. Second thoughts were given. There was a moment of concern from Grange, too. If the explosives were detonated, the Black Marauder would walk from its cavern. I've had 70 years of experience making bad decisions, Grange said. I can recognize them when they come along, and I get the feeling that this is going to be one of the worst. He took the detonator from his pocket, flicked it on, and after a moment's hesitation, pressed the button. Even at a distance, the sound was enormous, rolling across the desert and returning from the nearby hills like the roar of an angry lion, one now free from its pit. A moment later, the smoke and dust cleared, and a great black hole in the rock revealed the mineshaft, allowing light to penetrate a place it had not touched for almost 4 decades, and perhaps to one place where it could never go. Months would pass in the Warren Crucius March militia, as the world outside seemed to go mad. By the time of 3074, things within the militia had started to become more tense. At least from the perspective of one Mechwarrior, the one who now officially owned the Blackened Marauder, which now sat within their hangars. Kevin Langstrom. Mechwarriors were a superstitious lot, typically, and the Crucius March militia were no different. Word seemed to spread as to what had entered their hangar. The ugly war machine. The one with a cursed history. And the one which was now in the hands of one of the most talented Mechwarriors was to be avoided. Even technicians wouldn't help with its maintenance. All of the responsibility for the maintenance for his new Battlemech, in his name, were foisted upon Kevin Langstrom. From here, it's hard to fully understand what happened. Langstrom would begin to display signs of paranoia, and began treating the other members of the militia with distrust and even disdain. He began foregoing social activities or physical contact. He became obsessed with the mech and its care, but also became increasingly ambitious, looking for promotion beyond where he was stationed, even in the hell that was the Blakest era. In fact, he was looking specifically to join the Certus Fusiliers. There was also resentment that only he was working on his newly acquired mount. Without anyone assisting him, he'd need to spend more and more time trying to keep the machine in working order. But there was a change in his attitude, a change in his mind. It was as if someone were manipulating him. In fact, he sooner wanted to simply be within the Marauder more than anything else. It seemed he even forewent much of his personal life to be with his Marauder, dreaming inside of it. His physical appearance began to deteriorate, and it looked like he was struggling to sleep or even cope with his emotions. Even eating became an afterthought. He began losing track of time. Hours, days, weeks, and months started to bleed together. His interactions with his cohort, with his fellow soldiers, descended as he did. Once the mech itself developed a persistent leg problem, it absorbed all of the remaining time of Kevin Langstrom, and his obsession seemingly began to reach its peak. He would be passed over for a promotion, being denied a chance to join the Fusiliers, and worse, he would feel entirely isolated, save for his Marauder itself. Even his friend and fellow Mechwarrior, Ipswich, couldn't break through to him. Then, finally, the Taurian Concordat, the aggressive Periphery power near the Federated Suns, came to reclaim what they had lost centuries prior: the world of Warren. Worse yet, the Taurians had been known, in their latest campaign, to come in hot with nuclear weapons. With the cows on their way, the militia prepared itself for battle, and Kevin was still alone, trying desperately to fix the cursed leg issue his Marauder had. Everyone else had techs helping them to get their mechs ready for combat on the eve of the Taurian invasion. Langstrom was alone. He fell out with Sergeant Grange in a heated dispute regarding what he knew was poor treatment, and also rumors he felt the sergeant had been spreading about the Marauder. While this may have been paranoid delusions, truthfully speaking, everyone acted oddly around the Marauder. Everyone avoided it, including, yes, the technicians. The Mechwarrior really was isolated because of the mech he'd come to possess, and no one was even ordered to help him, even on the eve of battle. Then, if all this wasn't enough, while slaving away trying to finally fix the myomers of his Marauder, Langstrom would be confronted by one of his peers, Byron. Byron, a Centurion pilot and a crude man, would brag about his coming promotion. Byron's disdain for the Marauder showed through too, spitting that he'd ordered the Black Marauder turned away from his prized Centurion, the mech marred with the term bucket of love across its hull. Byron's mistake would be pushing his comrade to his limit on the eve of battle, and it was most certainly a grave mistake. The little man never knew when to stop. Think you're big 'cause you have your own mech? Well, what else do you have? Nothing. That's what. No friends, no future. No one here likes you. No one's gonna miss you when you're gone. And believe me, you'll be gone one day soon if I can help it. Shut up. I'll have you cashiered out of here, or maybe even court-martialed, and this heap of trash will be sent to the scrapyard where it belongs. It'll rot and so will you, down in some deep dark hole. Shut up! Kevin roared. The throbbing in the back of his head burst forward, shunting his conscience into a cubbyhole. Rage like he'd never known tore through him, overriding everything but the need for an outlet. And it had one. Kevin spun around, raising the wrench high, registering the sudden terror on Byron's face as he realized he had just pressed past the boundaries of too far. Blood was splattered across the floor as Kevin mercilessly smashed and broke his counterpart with the wrench. The rage took something from him, something he didn't know or understand. He also didn't know if he'd get it back. But he'd done it, swinging until he couldn't anymore. He had ended Byron's snide comments and antagonizing remarks. Forever. The remnants of Byron's body needed to be done away with. There was a voice, something from within himself, but perhaps not, that whispered to him the solution to his problems. The limping leg of his Marauder would be resolved with a new lubricant, one rich with iron. The blood was done away with the simple use of a hose. Byron's body, on the other hand, became one with the Black Marauder's leg. A low moan left the armored plating of the leg after his work was done. But Kevin was beyond caring, nor did he believe what he had heard all the same. But the leg was fixed. He would slumber in the cockpit of his Marauder that night, engrossed with dreams. He felt no guilt, or shame, or regret, even when he had first anticipated it. He had dreamt within the cockpit, a dream of colors and shapes. It was splashed in colors that the human mind had never named, or comprehended, so he'd come to call them in their own names. Ultra blue, infragreen, and sideways red. The shapes would begin to take form into people he knew, from the unit, or from his family, even his last friend in the unit, Ipswich, as well as a girl he had managed to lay down with, from months earlier after going out to the bar, before the Marauder had entered his life. Near the end, he leaped into a new world, one where he had clawed feet and a hunched body, and skin of armor, an armor as black as night, seeing a human shape becoming his enemy. Before things could carry on further, he would awaken. The bay swarmed with pilots and techs as everyone got ready. This was his chance to prove himself in combat, and he yearned for it. He wanted to be a warrior, not just some killer. He was ready. The Marauder was ready. It powered up seemingly on its own. Or he must have accidentally done it in his sleep. But now, they were heading out. It would be battle with the Concordat. As they left the hangar, though, he cast one final glance at the only unmoving mech in the bay. Across from him, Bucket of Love stood unmoving. It would not take to the field that day. Would it wonder where its pilot was? Would it miss him? Of course not. It was only a machine. The battle that came was hardly one draped in glory. In fact, what was left of Kevin's sanity seemed to be the price he paid for participating in it. Outside of a town named Cobalt, near the edge of the Pashadan Flats, the Warren Crucius March militia would come into contact with the Taurian Concordat's liberation force, of the world they'd not governed for almost 500 years. The enemy host at this location was headed by a lance of Battlemechs, as well as a fleet of vehicles, infantry, and even battle armor. The Black Marauder would begin taking fire from an enemy Jägermech, the heaviest of the opposing combatants. Returning the favor, he fired wildly, being unable to tag the enemy heavy mech at such an extreme distance. Receiving orders from his commanding officer, Lieutenant Engels, he divided up to take down the enemy's hovercraft first. It was a sound plan. The Mechwarriors also wanted to avoid damaging the communities they were set to protect. But there was a hunger amongst one of them. A hunger to not only prove themselves, but a hunger for violence and control. Where did it come from? Was it from within? Kevin was losing track of the battle even as he experienced this. He was losing where he was, both physically and mentally. Standing over the smoldering hulk of a tank, his mech was now in the midst of the town. Enemy forces were beginning to appear on sensors that he'd not remembered seeing prior. People were screaming over the comms to him. Grasping at a moment to take in what was going on, he looked at every red dot on his HUD. The Taurians were overwhelming the town, if it had not been overwhelmed already. In essence, the battle was over. The Federated Sons had been defeated, and there was little anyone could do about it. To Kevin, it seemed as though the hidden units were appearing out of nowhere, but he also moved from one place to another without fully realizing it. Just how much was he piloting the mech, one must wonder. A thunderbolt would appear from one of the streets, ripping into his Marauder, and the two immediately started trading blows, only for it to be forced back by Lieutenant Engels. Engels would see, for a brief moment, the shredded body within the Marauder's leg, having been made exposed by the thunderbolt's fire. Before he could broadcast further, the lieutenant was killed by an enemy snake, a Taurian medium mech sold to them by the Capellan Confederation. A shot struck his cockpit, killing him. In response, Kevin and his Marauder hunted and hounded the snake to death, even as it tried to escape, keeping on it and keeping his fire into it, until the mech split open and collapsed. Where it had fallen into a heap was on the wreckage of one of his only friends in the unit, the Valkyrie piloted by Mechwarrior Ipswich. The head had been punctured and destroyed. There was no ejection. Twisting into a rage, Langstrom slid into his mech, becoming seemingly one with it. The engine became his heart. His sensors became his eyes. Before this, his fighting had been sloppy, even panicked. That was no longer the case. The Marauder went on a rampage. His fire tore through buildings, collapsing them onto a hovercraft to start with. The Black Marauder charged through a grocery store in order to rip a Shadowhawk apart, blasting through the core of the surprised mech while doing so. The Marauder chased down enemy infantry, carving through them with laser fire as if they were being butchered in a meat shop. Tanks, APCs, everything was being consumed by the beast. He'd become one with the Marauder as he tuned out voices and pressed forward. His old mech, a Vindicator, was blasted apart in the thick of the fighting by the Jaeger mech that first targeted him before the primary engagement. Now it was meat. He blasted through its leg as it impotently fired its autocannons at him, before his mighty Marauder, the predator that it was, stalked over it and crushed the cockpit with its clawed foot. Slowly, he seemed to come through the other side. His own mech had only taken exterior damage, save for the internals of his left leg. Thankfully, in his mind, the special lubricant had clearly worked, as the leg was still working just fine now. But when he took this window of time to look around the battlefield, what had been Cobalt came into its true view. The town had been all but annihilated. Sergeant Grange, the man who'd given Kevin this Marauder, even signing it over to him, the last man in the unit other than himself seemingly, at least in this engagement, came to his side, but not to congratulate him. "What have you done?" "I've destroyed the enemy. Isn't that what we're supposed to do?" "You destroyed the town! These are our people, the ones we're supposed to protect! You trashed their homes, their school, their church!" It turns out the entirety of the Davion defenders had been put into retreat already. Kevin had believed himself some kind of savior, but truth be told, he destroyed the town for nothing. And Grange told him as much. Grange, as if realizing what was now guiding the mech, demanded Kevin get out. You're gonna have to give it up. What? You're gonna have to give it up. Get out before anything worse happens. Forget it. Son, I ain't asking you. Get out of it right now. You're coming back to base with me, and that's gonna be the end of it. We're pulling off this world, and that thing's staying behind. Let the Taurians have it, our last revenge. Outrage twisted in Kevin's chest at the thought of his mech in the hands of a filthy Taurian cow. He would never allow it. Never. The response was PPC fire, rather than compliance. Hatred fueled what Kevin had become as he tore through his mentor's enforcer. Despite Grange's experience, and despite his enforcer having taken less damage, piece by piece he took the mech, blasting both of its arms off, leaving the enforcer with little more than a single small laser, lighting up the enforcer with a volley of final rounds. He ripped open its engine's shielding. The mech exploded in a magnificent blast, bringing down a series of the remaining structures in the town with the force of the explosion. Grange would eject before the blast took his mech. Kevin celebrated it with a primal cheer at his victory, not even recognizing his own injuries or the intense heat in the cockpit. But there was something he had not noticed during all of this, and that was that a force had arrived that was neither Taurian nor Fedsun. Pirates had been lingering, mostly light mechs led by a medium. They had clearly been moving in the wake of the Taurians, looking to loot what they could. In this case, they were coming for a bank. The bandits were cordial enough for pirates, even though their mechs appeared decorated with human bodies, as they had been chained to them. Whether they were real or not, Kevin couldn't decide. Nice show. And to think, all we came here for was the bank. I should thank you and the cows for the distraction. In and out with no problems. I'm curious, why would a Fedrat blast another Fedrat? Other than the joy such an act brings, I mean. It just doesn't seem like the behavior you would expect from two comrades in arms. What'd he do? Sleep with your sister? While the pirate lead prattled on in his Phoenix Hawk, he'd not realized how much danger he was in. His fellow light mech riding Mechwarriors were in no mood for a fight, and Kevin could feel it, seeing how tense they all were. In truth, the Black Marauder was already on the hunt for more, sizing up just what was going to be an obstacle and what wasn't. And there was only one obstacle that Kevin and his dragon saw. The conversation was simple. The pirate was looking to recruit him over to his own team, as it were. Whoever this was pointed out the obvious. He was facing the hangman's noose if he returned to the armed forces of the Federated Suns, especially after knocking out a friendly. He laid things out very simply for him, showing Kevin the only real path forward he could. So, two options. Number 1, stay here, get court-martialed, lose the very mech you just fought oh so hard to save. Or door number 2, you could leave this worthless dustball behind. Leave the whole Federated Suns behind. Come with us, live the life of a pirate, and know what it is to truly be free. Pillage, plunder, and kill whoever you want. It's all fair game. We're bound for Tortuga, where I've got a friend who wants to rebuild the Fusiliers. What do you say? Wanna be a Fusilier? Kevin, days earlier, only wanted to be one. Admittedly, it was one of a different stripe, but was not a Fusilier a Fusilier? I accept. Kevin said. It made sense. He was a Marauder. It was his nature. Tortuga it will be, but just so you know. He raised the Marauder's right arm, and with casual grace triggered the PPC. The blast took the Phoenix Hawk square in the face, coring the cockpit and venting excess energy through the back. The headless mech remained standing for a moment, its posture reflecting confused shock, before toppling over with a crash. The other pirates raised their weapons, but none fired. I lead, Kevin said, sweeping his arm across them. You follow. Contented static crackled in his earpiece. Tension stretched across the seconds. Then the mech on the far right of the pirate line, a worn stinger that had probably seen service since the Reunification War, lowered its laser and straightened. Drop ships over the ridge. The Mechwarrior indicated a distant rise. Captain. With that, Kevin knew. The stars beckoned. Kevin and his Marauder would become something more infamous in the years that followed. In fact, Tortuga would never be the same because of him, or because of the Marauder that is with him. A Marauder which acts on its own. A Marauder which shows visions beyond vision, and colors past color. It would lose any reputation of being a mere Battlemech. Mechwarrior Kevin Langstrom died on Warren, but long before the Taurian invasion. He was truthfully left behind by Sergeant Grange when he took him to the mine. Black Kevin Langstrom and the Dark One were the creatures now standing in his place. But which was the master, and which was the servant? Or were they one?
That's for you to find out.
Thank you for joining me here today. So, doing these kinds of scripts are actually really hard, and obviously this video is pretty different from what I normally do, even compared to long format videos. So much of the Black Marauder's story is really interlinked with Kevin's. And so the first half of the video was formatted a lot more how I wanted to do the whole thing, but there kinda had to be a pivot in the second half. I had to retell a lot of this story in a more limited form. The story, by the way, being called Kindred Soul. By the way, there is way more about this monstrosity out there. I've got links to both Battletech Marauder from Catalyst Game Labs as well as Shrapnel Issue 10, which has another one of the Black Marauder stories in it. Overall, I thoroughly enjoyed the series, even if the video had to be cut short. I'm just giving you all a bit of an introduction, kind of, as to what this thing is. Because guess what? There is a degree of ambiguity to what's real and what's not in the story. I personally think the Marauder is an AI with an advanced neural interface, but it could also be an extra-dimensional horror within the hull of a prototype Marauder, brought in by the neural link. Or it could just be that Kevin Langstrom was mad, and Sergeant Grange had tall tales. There are literally endless possibilities with whatever your mind can come together with. I want to give a huge shout out though to the author of the Black Marauder series, Lance Scarinci, for doing such an incredible job with the series. I do like the first 3 stories a bit more than the last 2, but they're all fantastic. Also props to CGL itself and Phil Lee, the editor of the Marauder story and Shrapnel magazine. Really, if you want a fun, spooky story to read for the spooky week this week, because this is being released around Halloween, I recommend checking it out. You won't be disappointed. I mean it. With all of that said, if you enjoyed, you know the drill. Smash the like button. Like the Black Marauder smashed the cockpit of that Jägermech. It does help, even if the term is kind of cringy. Also, if you're new here, I do tons of Battletech content. Subscribe and stick around, there is more to come. And of course, to the channel members, thank you for your support, guys. I say this every time and I mean it. This content is really only made possible because of viewers like you. All the outer space art in this video was provided by Battletech Designs, and I think it fit the themes perfectly for what I wanted to tell. Alright everyone, what did you think of this video? What do you think of the Black Marauder itself, and its story so far? Did you guys want me to do part 2 at some point in the nebulous future? Does this need a follow-up? Let me know in the comment section below, and I'll catch you all there. But also, don't forget to check out the book itself. I really do mean it. It's a really fun read.